Welcome to the Fiscal Physical Podcast. Join us each week as we sit down with the founder of Alchemy Wealth Management and author of Your Fiscal Physical, Ryan Nelson. Tune in to gain valuable insights and practical tips as we simplify complex financial concepts into digestible lessons. From budgeting to retirement planning, this podcast is your go-to resource for mastering financial literacy.
Welcome, everybody, to this week's episode of the Fiscal Physical Podcast. I am back. I am Aaron Hoisington, and I am here with the founder of Alchemy Wealth Management, author of Your Fiscal Physical, 7 Keys to Becoming Financially Fit. You can find that on Amazon, and his name is Ryan Nelson. Ryan, how are you today?
I'm doing really well. How are you doing, Aaron?
I am doing pretty solid, and I just want to pause and thank all our listeners who are checking us out here on the different platforms. Really appreciate the feedback, the support you guys have been giving us here, and all over the world who have been listening to these podcasts somehow. I appreciate you. We appreciate you guys tuning in on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, anywhere you get your podcasts. And so we couldn't do it without you. I mean, we probably could, but it'd be a lot boring or boring if no one listened to these. So, but let's talk today, Ryan, about a pretty exciting topic. We'll talk about supply and demand. How does that grab you?
I love it. I absolutely love supply and demand.
Yeah,
Let's do it.
That gets you going there, I'm sure. So, this is one of the topics that I always felt like I had a good handle on. I'm like, oh, supply and demand. It gets thrown around. It's from a young age. I was like, oh, I kind of know, supply, demand. And then I started researching it a bit more, and I'm just like, well, there's a little bit more into this than I thought, maybe. So when we scheduled this one, I was like, all right, cool. Maybe Ryan can, dig me out of this rabbit hole that I kind of got into with it. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you, man. Hopefully you can break it down in an easy and digestible manner.
Let's do it. So supply and demand. I mean, truly, I really do love his supply and demand. I think that it is funny. It describes so much of what happens like in the world. Mm-hmm. There's so many questions I get from just like clients where really like the root of the answer comes down to supply and demand. Mm-hmm. And that really is like the driving factors that are like describing an event they're confused about or have questions about, or, so supply and demand, super cool. Everybody I'm sure that's listening has heard supply and demand.
Yes, definitely.
But like they may not have like the most in-depth understanding of like how the two relate. Mm-hmm. And so this is one where I love graphs and graphical representations. Of course, this is a podcast. There's no visuals, and so
yeah, it's gonna be tough.
So I'll try to explain it as best over the air, so to speak, as possible. But this really would be one if this is of any interest to you at all. Hopping on a quick Google search and just Googling supply and demand curves. I think this is one where a picture can potentially say 1,000 words, and so I'll kind of tried to explain this graph and how it makes sense, like how it just makes sense. But so if you think about supply and demand, so we always say, supply and demand, they come to an equilibrium. That's how we would determine effectively a price. And so if we think about, so if you think about a graph and you were to graph both the supply and demand curve, supply would be going up into the right. Mm-hmm. Okay. Demand would be going down into the right. So you almost have like an X on this graph.
Okay.
Right in the middle of that where they cross each other, that is what we call the equilibrium. So if you look at this graph, the bottom, so what we call the X-axis, the bottom of the graph represents quantity, and the Y-axis, so what's on the left-hand side of the graph, that represents price. So if you look now, you have so this graph on the bottom is quantity, on the left axis or the Y-axis is price. Now you have this kind of X in the middle of this, right? Supply is going up and to the right, demand is going down and to the right, and right at the middle of those, you could sort of look at where they intersect, and that would be a certain quantity and a certain price. And so that's telling you at that supply and that demand, at that quantity of supply and that quantity of demand, what the price would be. And so what's interesting and why I like these curves is what they help you visually see is if supply or demand changes.
Mm-hmm.
So demand could go up, demand could go down, supply could go up, supply could go down. And how would that affect prices, right? And so, if let's say I was, selling rubber ducks, and all of a sudden, I was selling 100 rubber ducks a week, and all of a sudden I got this huge influx of 500,000 rubber ducks.
Mm-hmm.
So a huge increase in supply. What do you think that would do to the price?
It would drop the price itself because there's a ton of rubber ducks out there.
The market's like flooded, right?
Yeah,
so
saturated with ducks.
The demand for rubber ducks probably stayed the same.
Right.
Mm-hmm. But maybe if I'm manufacturing rubber ducks, I just made an error on my purchase order, and all of a sudden I got 500,000 rubber ducks, and now I have way too many rubber ducks. So the supply is way high, and the demand stayed the same, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if you look at these curves, what's interesting, so supply, the curve going up and to the right, it's moving further to the right. And so now this X where it crosses is lower. Mm-hmm. So the price has fallen. I know that's a little hard to conceptualize over words, but now if we were to do the opposite, so let's say I was selling 100 rubber ducks a week, and I mess up my PO, and I only got one rubber duck this week. The same demand for it, but now I only have one rubber duck. What would that do to the price?
It's going to raise that price.
Drive it up,
yeah,
right?
Definitely.
So that one I feel like is intuitively easy for us to wrap our heads around. Mm-hmm. Demand can sometimes be a little more challenging. But again, if we take the same example, so let's say we have 100, we're used to selling 100 rubber ducks. We normally order 100 rubber ducks per week. And so our orders are all good. We order our 100 rubber ducks, but all of a sudden they're doing a rubber duck race, and all these people want rubber ducks. So I still have my 100 rubber ducks.
Right.
But now, there's thousands of people that want rubber ducks. What would that do to the price?
It's going to raise the price on that.
Raise the price, right? So now an increase in demand with the same supply is going to raise the price. Or let's say we just get out of this rubber duck fiasco, or, rubber ducks get, whatever. We find out that the rubber in rubber ducks is making people sick.
Sure.
So I have the same number of rubber ducks. People no longer want to, now there's, only one person looking to buy a rubber duck. Mm-hmm. I still have 100 rubber ducks. Supply is the same. Demand has decreased. What's that going to do to price?
Going to drop that price. Yep.
If you have the same supply and demand has decreased, it's going to drop the price, right? And so this you see this just,
everywhere.
Everywhere. Yeah. That interaction was obviously silly and fairly straightforward to follow. Obviously, in the real world, in the economy, it's far more complex. But yeah, you literally see this everywhere. So one of the examples I love to give is, and I included it in my book, is about airline tickets. Mm-hmm. And so, as you're looking to buy an airline ticket and you want to maybe buy an airline ticket, you might hear one person talking and say, hey, I had to buy this airline ticket. I had to buy it at the last minute. I bought it a week before and I got hosed. I had to pay so much. I had to pay double what it would have cost. Mm-hmm. And then you hear somebody else, they say, yeah, I just took a trip to Mexico. It was awesome. We were willing to book last minute. And so since we were flexible, we got a price. It only cost us $30 to go to Mexico, right? And it's like, wait, we're talking airline flights. We're talking buying them a week before. And one person saying they paid so much more, one person saying they got a huge deal because they bought it last minute. So what's better? But is buying an airline ticket last minute, is it going to save you money or cost you more?
Whew. Yeah, it's going to depend. I mean,
exactly.
Oh, that's such an interesting analogy.
The reality is buying it last minute has nothing to do with the price.
Sure.
What's going to dictate the price is supply and demand, right? And people get caught up in, you start to draw these conclusions and you say, oh, so buying it last minute saves me money. Or, oh, buying it last minute costs me a fortune. It's like, well, no, probably supply and demand is going to dictate what those prices are. Sometimes that supply and demand is in your favor and will make the ticket cheaper. Sometimes it's not in your favor and will make it more expensive, right? So the example I always like to get, if you're buying a last minute flight, and let's say there's only one seat left on the plane, and the airline knows, hey, there's going to be a couple people wanting this seat, and there's only one seat left. The airline knows we can jack up this price, and people will pay it, and somebody does, right? And they need to buy that ticket. They do, and so the airline's just running a profitable business. They know that the supply has decreased, the demand or the supply has decreased. The demand's either staying the same or has gone up, and so now the price will go up.
That's such an interesting kind of thing because I mean, in my brain's working overtime right now, and I'm just thinking about equating it to a housing market, or anything related to that. And I wonder where. I just think about the ethical consideration of that too, and that's we could probably do a whole different podcast on that, so we won't get into it too much. But I think that knowing that you have the supply,
right?
I have the 100 rubber ducks, or I have the 100 airline tickets that everybody wants, I can charge whatever I want for those specifically. And so like, I think it's probably a delicate dance to be like, well, how much ethically can we charge for this where people are going to go like, yes, I think that's still worth it. We still want that. We still need that versus being like, okay, no, screw you. I'm not buying that. Like it's way too expensive specifically. So, wow. It's, I'm just thinking of all the different things in my scenarios in my head where that all kind of runs together and all plays out. So, taking it out of like, oh, buying last minute is good or bad. It's like, well, it depends like on the situation itself.
Yeah. So what's interesting, what that makes me think of is, God, I'm trying to find this real quick. But so Ozempic,
the weight loss.
Yep, exactly. So Ozempic, I think, did it happen this week or last week? Ozempic, they're getting some, I don't know that I want to say they're in trouble, but they're maybe getting their wrists slapped for charging so much for this drug. And so, it's to your point, these ethical concerns. So they're charging, I think it's like $900 a month for Ozempic because the demand is there.
Right. Oh, yeah, definitely.
It's been like the most profitable drug. It's planned to be, or it's on target, I think, to be the most profitable drug of all time, if I'm not mistaken. And so the demand for this thing is crazy. So basic supply and demand would dictate that the price should go up.
Sure.
Now, is that ethical?
Probably not.
It's a drug. Now let me. So I it's funny that you say this. I was literally thinking about this today. So at first I said, they should be able to charge whatever they want. It's supply and demand. If it gets to a point where it's too high, the demand will go down.
Right.
If they raise the price too much, the demand will go down. And again, supply and demand will dictate what the price is. So this is why I love supply and demand. You could get mad at this company for charging a lot, but it's us as the consumers that are driving the price. It's not them. Us, we're the ones increasing demand. If we stop buying it, the demand drops away, the price will fall, right? So at first I said, well, they should be able to charge whatever they want. And then I say, well, it is a drug. People need it. Some people need it. Some people take it for aesthetic reasons. Either way, should they be charging this much? Well, I think I heard, even if this is wrong, directionally the argument stays the same, is I think it cost them $10 billion to develop this drug.
Okay.
So imagine you or I have some medical illness and we want the medical community to solve this illness we have. Well, if it's going to cost $10 billion to solve this illness, who's going to do it? Nobody. Unless on the back end, they know they can make a fortune.
Right. Yeah.
So if they know, if we do find the cure, it may take us $10 billion to find this, but on the back end, we'll make $100 billion. That a business, a pharmaceutical company could start justifying that and saying, okay, this could be a good investment for us, right? And then for you and I, the people that will actually benefit from this, will say, who cares what they who cares what they profit? I just want somebody to find the cure, or to create the medicine, or to solve this problem we have, right? And if it requires them to become super profitable to incentivize them to even dive into the issue to begin with, I don't know that I have an issue with that, right?
Right.
So,
wow.
I don't know. It's a really interesting issue. I don't know how you solve any of them. I don't know that there is like an inherent. Well, I know that there is no inherent right or wrong here. But yeah, the ethical issue you brought up. I mean, it's playing out real time right now with Ozempic, and I don't know that there is a solution for it. Ozempic took a huge risk, or they took a huge risk to develop Ozempic, and so. I don't know. Should they be rewarded for that?
Right.
Probably. How much? I don't know. How could you decide? But also, is it us, the consumers, that are effectively dictating the price by creating the demand?
Yeah. What a fascinating kind of case study. I'm sure it happens all the time. You could probably just pick one or the other, like overall, but specifically with pharmaceuticals and like the ethical consideration of like, well, if it's medically needed, is $900 a month, like, or whatever for this drug, is that feasible, or are people just like, well, I can't pay that, I'm going to die? Like, it's a whole different,
it's a whole can of worms.
And obviously,
the people who need it, I think, can still access it through insurance. But then then you get down this whole, you can see how the supply and demand, again, it has its hands in everything. So many topics that I hear come up, it's like, that's really a supply and demand conversation, which, if you like supply and demand, then.
And even if you don't like, knowing about it, like knowing kind of the root cause of a lot of these things, and at least being like, taking a step back and being like, okay, what's the supply, what's the demand, and how is this affecting the price? Is it me when I'm buying it, or is it the amount that's available and the people that want it, like overall? So just kind of, I think that hopefully, if you guys take anything away from this podcast, it's just kind of thinking, maybe becoming a little bit more literate in that regard of like, hey, like, is this playing into this? Is this supply and demand, or is this something totally different? And I think that now that my brain is kind of working like this, I'm just like, I can see that all the time. I can see that in daily life all the 100%. Time. 100%. So awesome, Ryan. Well, really appreciate it, man. Thank you so much for breaking that down there and kind of getting us going in that subject. And we'll be right back on the other side of this to talk about some personal stuff.
Perfect.
And now to put the personal in personal finance.
Welcome, everybody, back to this side of the Fiscal Physical podcast. We are in our personal section here, and I happen to be, luckily, joined by a business owner, Mr. Ryan Nelson. And, Ryan, I just got a question just as far as, and this is, it's going to be interesting to get your point of view on this because you've worked, where you didn't own your own, you worked for a different company, you've owned your own business here. And so I'd like to just get your thoughts on like the 40-hour work week, if that makes sense here. And specifically if everybody talks about, the 9 to 5, or now it's kind of the 8 to 5, whatever it is. Like, do you view that as like as potentially like a sustainable thing moving forward, I guess, like just working like 40 hours a week, or like, I don't know how many hours you work a week. I'm kind of rambling there a little bit, but
sure.
I don't know if you get
it. Yeah. I don't know that I personally have like super strong opinions on it. But I mean, so here's my thoughts. So what do you think? I'll throw some trivia back at you real quick.
Heck yeah.
So in a normal, let's call it 8-hour workday, how many hours do you think the just average American is productive? So how many hours of productivity out of the 8-hour workday?
Probably, I'd say 5.
Nice. Okay. I feel like when I had looked this up in the past, I thought I had seen like 6 hours somewhere in that same neighborhood. So I looked it up today and I saw that it's less than 3.
Oh, okay. Oh,
yeah. It was like 2.8. I saw a bunch of different, you can look up 100 different articles probably and find 100 different numbers. But I saw a couple that were in the neighborhood of 2.8 to like 4.3, bunch around 3. And again, I don't know, like, I didn't dive into any of the actual like research or anything, right? I don't care that much.
Sure.
But the reality is, it's a low number.
Right.
And so I don't know what that means. It means something. I'm not sure what it means. But let's say that the average number of hours of actual productive work is like 3 hours. I kind of buy it because, you imagine in a normal workplace, you're going to the water cooler, you're going to the restroom, you're coming back, you start working, you get an email that interrupts you, you get distracted, you go back to work, you have to stop early to go to the meeting, but you go, 10 minutes early to the meeting, you hit the restroom, you walk to the meeting room, definitely. Right? Yeah. You do the meeting. Is that productive? Probably not really. You come back, you try to do productive work. Again, it's just constant interruptions. And so, I think one initial like takeaway could be, well, if we have 3 hours of productivity a day, why not just work 3 hours a day?
Right.
But then I think, well, because in order to get 3 hours of productivity, we have to be there for 8 hours. So if we cut the workday down to 4 hours, we'd only get 1.5 hours of productivity, right? So I don't know that like just changing the work hours we work solves any problem. If we're getting 3 hours of productivity out of an 8-hour day, there's probably, I think it's almost like the wrong question. Like the number of hours we work is probably like the wrong question to be asking. Right. And the better question is like, what's the issue with our productivity and how do we increase that? And, so I don't know that I have any real strong opinions on a 40-hour work week at all. I know like I now have the luxury of having a more flexible work schedule since I own my business. And I do not know what that means if I end up working more or working less. But I do know that, the business only grows like when I'm working, right? And so like my quality of work is on a different level, I feel like, than, when I was an employee. And sometimes I will work for like 3 hours of like ultra productive work, and I'll be exhausted. I'm like, God, that was like 2 days worth of work. I feel like it feels like if you're really, really, really truly focused and just like knocking out some good work, like you can't really work 8 hours of that that being like mentally. I suppose it depends on the job, right?
Sure.
But if it's a mentally draining job, like, or physically demanding, I'm not sure how you could even do 8 hours of like pure physical work or pure mental work. But yeah, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, and you make a lot of great points. And one of the things I've always said, like, because I've always worked a 40-hour work week. That's pretty much, if not a little bit more,
sure,
in certain cases. And I completely echo, like, you probably get 5 to 6 really good productive hours out of me. And there's a couple hours in there, and hopefully my employer's not listening, that like I really don't do a lot. Like it's hard to like continue
like 38 of the 40.
Yeah. Your words. But I think that there are situations where I always told my wife when I first met her, I was like, hey, you know what would be great? If I could work 30 hours a week but get paid for 40. I was like, if I could do that, if I could work 5-6 hour days, I think that in my head you would get the best work out of me, because I feel like most of that would be productive. Right. But you posed the great point about like, well, if we have to, if it's 3 hours of productive work that we're getting out of most people and we have to be there for 8 hours, like at 6 hours, you're like, okay, well, you're probably only getting like and 2 hours.
Right.
Like,
yeah. Yeah. I think you're addressing the wrong issue.
Yeah. I think so as well. I think that I kind of think about that. That's maybe the wrong way to go about that. And I think it's more about figuring out like how you can maximize the productivity and what that equates to in productive hours, if you will. And so,
I have seen a lot of studies. I know nothing about this. Again, I'm talking way over my head, but I'm curious, just as we're spitballing here. I've seen studies where companies will go to like 4 8-hour days. So drop from a 40-hour week to a 32-hour week, and the productivity stays the same. I have to wonder though, is all those people were used to doing 40 hours worth of work, quote unquote, and now they working 32 and they know what they need to get done each week. They're just getting that done. So yeah, they are being a little more productive with the time in the office. But I do wonder if that sort of normalizes over time, and say a new employee that's hired who had no idea what the normal workload is now kind of falling, and I wonder if, if an employer moves from 40 hours to 32, they get the same productivity. You reflect back on that same business 10 years from now. Are they still getting that same level of productivity, or is it more normalized? I have zero idea. One quick question for you before we go. What are your thoughts on working a 100-hour work week?
That sounds pretty impossible.
Yeah, I feel like that's a number I hear relatively frequently about somebody working like 100+ hours a week. And
how?
Yeah, exactly. I know back when I was doing engineering, working at a power plant, we worked basically 13-hour days. It was shift work. We worked 13-hour days. I worked 7 days. There was this time where you could take on like optional overtime.
Sure.
And so this was over a decade ago. And so I like, there was 1 month where I took on just like a ton of overtime. And so I was working 13 hours a day. So if you think about that, 13 hours, if it takes you an hour to get ready in the morning, an hour at night, then that's 15 hours in the day. If you sleep for 8 hours, there's 23 hours. You have an hour left to do grocery shop, every single chore you'd need to do, everything, right? And that's only 91 hours a week.
Oh my gosh.
What? Right. So I just think it's kind of funny. I hear people all the time, like, not all the time, but fairly frequently brag about like working 100+ hours a week. And it's just not sustainable if you want 8 hours of sleep.
No, yeah. If you want 6 hours, like if you really have to make some sacrifices there in what you're kind of doing there. So, I mean, more power to you. If that's what you want to do, awesome. But like, the idea of 100 hours in my mind like makes 40 sound pretty good.
Yeah, like, I certainly don't strive to work 100 hours a week.
No, probably, hopefully never. So, awesome. Well, thank you so much, Ryan. Appreciate it as always. Thank you to our listeners out there, and we'll be back next week with another fun topic to tackle. And I'll let you end us here, Ryan.
As always, stay the course.
Thank you for joining us for the Fiscal Physical Podcast. Until next time, happy listening. And as always, stay the course. If you have a question or topic suggestions, please email us at podcast@alchemywealth.com. If you enjoyed today's discussion, subscribe to the podcast to ensure you never miss an episode, and consider leaving us a rating and review on your favorite platform. This helps other listeners like you find the show. For more resources, you can visit Alchemy Wealth Management's website at www.alchemywealth.com or find your Fiscal Physical, the book, on Amazon. We'd be remiss if we didn't mention that personal finance is just that, personal. Please don't take anything we say as advice. The preceding content is for informational and entertainment purposes only. It's not an offer or a solicitation, nor should it be construed or relied upon for tax, legal, or investment advice. It doesn't consider your personal financial situation or objectives and may not be suitable for you.